welcome everybody to Sally's Backyard and the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society's Beginner Gardener Series as part of PHS and Harvest 2020. The truth of the matter is we don't feed our plants, we feed our soil, and our soil feeds our plants. So how do we go about doing that? Next week is going to be the workshop specifically on soils. So we're going to give you a little sneak preview about soils 101, and what goes into soil. Everything in the world is made, everything goes somewhere. So soil is formed when big rocks, big pieces, become smaller pieces, and smaller pieces, and smaller pieces, and smaller pieces. And that's what gives us the minerals in our soil. Next week, we'll talk in detail about how the big pieces become little pieces, but generally erosion, wind, water, freezing, thawing makes the big rocks turn into tiny little particles. Here in Philadelphia, those particles are so tiny that they are mostly clay, and that's a really challenging way to grow our plants. Here in Philly, the particles are so small that the roots can barely get between them. So what do we have to do? What do we have to add to make that soil, which is full of minerals, available to our plants? How do we feed our plants using the clay that is Philadelphia? Well, the clay and all of that stuff, the clay, the sand, the silt, all of that stuff, because some of you are from Jersey and it's mostly sand there, bigger particles, those are what give us the chemistry that helps our plants to grow. But what about the biology? That's what we're talking about today. Those things that we take to take the big pieces like trees and animals and garbage and poop and all of those things, break them down into smaller pieces and smaller pieces and smaller pieces and smaller pieces into such small pieces that they're available to the tiny little root hairs on the ends of the roots of the plants that we're growing. So we take the chemistry, that is the soil, and the biology, that is the organic matter, and we put them together, and as we always say, that's where the magic happens. So what minerals and nutrients and things do our plants need to be able to grow? I want to talk a little bit today about fertilizers, because that's the first place people go. They say, I want to feed my plants, so I'm going to go get Miracle Grow. Not what you want to do. Compost, fertilizers. Let's talk about fertilizers for a minute. And I know my close-up camera doesn't work for beans, so I'm going to tell you that this is water-soluble fertilizer, and it is all-purpose 20-20-20. What the heck does that 20-20-20 stand for? I'm looking at this one, and this one is made from worm poop, and it is 131. Again, it gave me 3 numbers. This is the Miracle Grow for roses. 18, 24, 16. Is that expiration date? Well, no. Those 3 numbers are how we look at all of the fertilizers that we add, all of the commercial fertilizers that we add. The 3 numbers stand for N, P, and K. So that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. I know potassium starts with a P, but the Latin word for it starts with a K. So N is for leaf growth, P is for roots and fruits and flowers, and K is for the general health of the plant. So what we need to do is to make sure all of those things are available to our plants. Are they the only 3 things that our plants need? Lord, no. We need magnesium, we need manganese, we need calcium, we need all of iron, we need lots of other things. Where do they come from? Well, a lot of them come from those big rocks that got broken down into little pieces in our clay. But we're also getting them from the bodies of those trees and animals and everything that we broke down with the creatures, the critters, the little micro critters in the soil. They broke them all down into small pieces, and that's where all of the different minerals and nutrients come from. These are the things that the plant needs to do photosynthesis, which means pulling sunlight out of the air, converting it using sunlight out of the atmosphere, and adding air and water and those nutrients and turning that into the body of the plant. So what do we have to do to make all of this work and for there to be a balance of all of these things in our soil so that our plants can reach down, pull them up, make the tomatoes that we need so badly in August here to make our mouths happy. So what can we do? What are the things that we add? Well, we can add fertilizers. We can add, the first question that I got when I started talking about soil additives after fertilizer is manure. Can we take manure and can we add it to the soil? Well, yes, we can take manure, but we don't want to take raw manure and add it to our soil because it's too strong. Most manures, like horse manure, is really high in that N there, that nitrogen, and that can burn the plants. So instead of taking manure and putting it directly on the soil, we want to add it to our compost and use our compost to mellow it out. That means break down the big pieces into smaller usable pieces. Can we use something called a green manure? What's a green manure? Is that when a horse poops green or a cow poops green? It's like, no. A green manure is a plant that we plant that also adds nitrogen to the soil. We plant it, we could plant it as a cover crop in the fall, and we talked about that last week. It's generally a plant that we blanket the soil with and then turn in and let it rot down. And it gives you basically the same ingredients that animal manure would give you added to the soil. So we can do that directly in the soil. And we'll talk about that more later. But what I want to talk about mainly today, and we have a lot of stuff to cover, is making our own organic matter with compost. So I want to talk about compost and how we make magic with it. And we're going to deconstruct a compost bin. We're going to build a new compost bin. And then if we've still got some time left over, we're going to talk about worm bins.
Sally, we do have one question from Nyla asking, what's wrong with Miracle-Gro?
What's wrong with Miracle-Gro? Okay. Miracle-Gro has the minerals in it that a plant needs to grow. The problem with Miracle-Gro is that the stuff is so concentrated that the chemical fertilizers are a salt. That doesn't mean that you could put them on your food, you would have them on your kitchen table, but the chemical construction is of a salt. So it is very, very, very much, will suck the moisture out of plants, and it's easy for a chemical fertilizer to burn your plants. So Miracle-Gro, because it is so concentrated, it's kind of like, I want to grow a plant in a pot. So I go and I get a truckload of soil and I dump it on top of the pot. It will put soil in the pot for me, but it kind of is a bit of overkill. So if I want to be growing something indoors and I want my soil to be sterile, then I'm fine with that, using Miracle-Gro in a dilute form. But if I want to keep my soil alive, which is a really, really important thing to do, because as long as your soil's alive and it's full of tiny little critters, they are biting the big pieces and chewing them up and pooping out the smaller pieces. And that's what gardening is all about. It's all about eating and pooping and eating and pooping. So if I'm using Miracle-Gro in my outdoor garden, it is so salty that it's irritating the heck out of my worms, and it is probably killing off most of my micro critters in the soil. Again, a lot of words for a short explanation, but do you get what I'm talking about?
Would you say that Miracle-Gro is maybe like a better use for houseplants instead?
It's a much better use for houseplants because inside your house, you don't want a lot of living soil. you want your soil to be fairly sterile. It's when you are growing larger plants or growing plants outside that you really, really, really want the soil to be alive.
And I think the other piece is that, one, if you have Miracle-Gro, and that's like the one thing you have access to use it. But compost, which we're going to dig into now, is a good alternative.
I have a compost bin. As you can see, this is my back door right here. Well, you can't see it. There. Trust me, there's my back door. There's my back door. And I have trained, we have 5 adults living in this house, and nobody's particularly interested in compost except me. But we are interested in keeping our, the amount of trash that we put out at as small as possible. So what I have done is set up a compost bin directly outside the back door so that we keep a little bin by the kitchen sink. And as we're, oh my goodness, I just found a missing fork. So as we're doing the dishes, cleaning our plates, we scrape all the garbage into our little bin. And then the little bin comes out and gets emptied directly into the compost bin, which is outside the back door. I've taken the top off, and I've already taken out all of the recognizable garbage. And now what we're getting at is halfway down, and I'm finding all kinds of good stuff like, ew, somebody put a garbage bag in there. It's not something that my worms are happily eating. Not breaking down fast because it's plastic or waxed. So what are the things that I don't want to put in my compost bin? This is pretty consistent whether you're using doing regular compost, passive compost, active compost, and I'll explain the difference in a second, or worm composting. I don't want to put any meat in or any bones. I don't like to put processed food like breads and things because I don't want to be attracting rodents to something that's right up against my house. Some people, we have a high cat population in the neighborhood, so I'm not worried about mice or rats coming to my compost, but I do have the fattest squirrels on the block because the squirrels have figured out how to open the compost bin, get in, and take out whatever it is that they desire, which is generally the fruit. They like fruit. So what goes in is my household garbage, and not bones, this is why I have no forks in my house. There's a second one. So somebody's not being very careful when they're putting their garbage out here. This is what I call a passive compost bin. I don't even know what that is, but it's interesting. Which means I don't turn it very often. We just dump, and then I scrape things out of the bottom. And then we dump stuff in. Periodically, someone will take dry leaves or shredded newspaper and cover up the live garbage with it because if my live garbage is sitting there, it's going to attract flies and it's going to make fruit flies, and I don't want that coming into my house because there's my back door right there. I open the door, fruit flies go in. So I want to keep this as tidy as I can, and but not be a lot of work. What I have used, I want to put, let's say that the garbage is our source of nitrogen. We like a nice combination of nitrogen and carbon because that's what breaks down the best to make our soil. There are lots of other micronutrients in there. There's calcium, iron, magnesium, manganese, all of those other things. But mostly it's nitrogen and carbon that makes the basis of our compost. So what I'm using, I want to be able to use up my household garbage. So that's what I want to be able to put in there. But to make that not turn into a fetid, stinky mess is I need to make sure that there's plenty of carbon. In fact, it's like 2-to-1 carbon to nitrogen. Actually, it's 70-30, but it's okay. 2-to-1 is easier to remember. So what am I using as my source of carbon? Well, when I start to rebuild this, I'm going to rebuild this with sticks and leaves and possibly some shredded newspaper, but shredded newspaper, that I'm going to save for my worm bin. But this is, this, if you see this, this is starting to really look like soil. You can see a lot of eggshells in there because they didn't break down very fast. In fact, they never break down forever and ever and ever, it seems like. But this was mostly dried leaves. So where did I get my dried leaves from? Well, they were giving them away free on the street in the fall. It's amazing. People bagged them up for me and put them out on the street, and I went around and collected them and saved them. In fact, I used my bags of leaves to insulate my fig tree first, and then when I took them off the fig tree in the spring, I brought them over to the compost, and I have mine in little crates here, and that's what I've used for my carbon source mainly. Sometimes I throw paper in here, my paper towels from the kitchen, napkins, things like that, paper plates for picnics. They all can go in here. It's funny to see the stuff. You see all kinds of stuff. This is a label from, I guess it was a broccoli or something. Plastic doesn't break down. Rubber bands don't break down, things like that. All right, so I have done this to death. And what I want to do is take it apart and start to build a new one properly. So if anybody's got any questions about the things that go into compost and then how we treat them, I can talk about that while I move the bin and the camera.
Sally, we've gotten this question twice, which is really great, about adding grass clippings and weeds from the garden into the compost. I know we've talked about this in other workshops where you can obviously add in grass clippings. Weeds, I think I've always heard a different answer from people.
Okay, thank you for asking that, both of those people and the people that thought it but didn't ask it. The weeds that I don't want to put into the bin are, I don't want to put weeds that have gone to seed, because in this compost bin, mostly everything is, this is a passive compost bin. It's a cool compost bin. It's way cool. It's just way cool because it's mine. But it's cool in that the compost never really heats up much. So if I had a larger compost bin, or the ones that you see that are huge, huge piles, they will heat up nicely. And that heat will get warm enough that it will manage to kill off the weed seeds that came with that came on the weeds, or any diseases that might have formed, that might have shown up in sick plants. So I don't want to put sick plants. There we go. Okay. I don't want to put sick plants in here. I don't want to put glass bottles in here. It's like an archaeological dig when you clean out your compost bin. Weeds that have gone to seed, and plants that have diseases on them, because I don't want to spread the disease into the soil so that the next batch of plants that I get that disease. I don't want that to happen. Okay, now I'm
Sally, can you give us a quick and dirty on the difference between a hot and a cool compost?
Sure. Because the little critters are eating my garbage, they're also creating heat. So as a byproduct of their digestion. So if there are enough critters and there's a critical mass, then which generally is 3 by 3 by 3 is the minimum for it in a compost bin. That heat that's generated in the middle of the compost bin is hot enough to kill the seeds and hot enough to kill most of the diseases. this kind of compost bin might get warm in the middle, but it's not going to get really, really warm. So this, if I put weeds into this that had seeds in them, I'm going to spread seeds whenever I use the soil. I put peppers and tomatoes in this, and I get baby peppers and tomatoes and melons and things, and squash. When they go in here and the seeds are still in the garbage, often those seeds will sprout right here in the compost. Or when I dig this up and take it to my garden, they sprout in my garden, and I get a lot of cherry tomatoes as weeds, which is not such a bad thing, but it's not such a great thing either. So I am going to pull the pieces off my compost bin and rebuild it in another space. So bear with me a sec to see if I can do this without killing the plastic. This is great. You get to hear my mouth, but you get to see my bottom instead. All right, so this is the plastic frame of the compost bin, and I'm going to move it over to next door, and then I'll move the camera. Come on, there must be more questions.
Sally, where did you get this compost bin from?
I have no idea. I think probably Craigslist. There was a time when there was a master composter program with the city, and you could get if you took a class, you could get a bin. And a lot of people still have those bins. Yeah, a lot of dead air space here because I'm stuck inside of the compost bin. And
well, Sally, we definitely have more questions.
Okay, well,
Patty,
ask the questions while I move the stuff.
Okay, Patty's asking, can you build a compost bin out of wood, or is plastic better?
I am not displeased with my plastic. It doesn't need to be plastic, but if you're willing to put out the money, you can buy fancy dancy ones. There are so many different kinds of compost bins out there, but all you need is a framework. So the easiest and cheapest kind of bin to build is one made out of a pallet, made out of pallets. You know what pallets are? Those are, what's another word for pallets? Skids. They are the flat shipping material that that stuff gets shipped in. I mean, I'm not sure how else to explain them, but they're generally 3.5 by 3.5, and they're about this thick. Wait a minute. Oh, here, about this thick, and they're just made out of wood, and you can hook them together. I have ripped up, cut up coat hangers. Buy up coat hangers and use those. This is ridiculous. I'm having a war here. I got it. I won.
And Sally, there are people that don't even have bins, right? You can just start a pile, and it'll just be a compost pile.
You could have a compost pile. I like a bin because I don't want my neighbors complaining to me that, oh, you caused us to have blah, 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 blah. If there's a mouse in the entire neighborhood and somebody knows you've got a compost bin, they like to blame you because people don't understand compost and they don't understand composting. So
Sandra's actually saying that they use an old trash can with holes drilled in it, and they have another one with several cracks in it too. So that's another alternative that is working just fine for them.
This is what I use. This is not my only compost bin. I have many because I have a yard that's full of leaves. Let me see if I can show you this. All right, so now I have rebuilt here's my compost, my new frame. I moved the frame over, and I'm just going to roughly build one, show you the layers. But this is what I use. I have a pile of they're called bulb crates, but you could use milk crates. You could use anything that is open to the air. And I collect my leaves and I layer them. I put that in there, and I can put garbage in there. I could mix my garbage right into there, add more dried leaves, and then put another one on top. And they will break down. Worms will find their way into that and help me to break that down. All the little bugs and flies and stuff will come and help me to break that down. And it didn't, I found these on the street. They're slightly bigger than like the Amoroso bread crates, but they really, really do the trick. Another thing that I have used in the garden is just a circle of fencing, just chicken wire in a circle. And then in my garden, I throw all of my leaves and, don't you love my, throw all of my leaves and weeds, and sometimes my, I don't put my kitchen scraps out in my garden because I don't want to draw rodents to the garden. But all I need to do is hold it together so that I can layer, like lasagna, greens, that's my garbage, or my grass clippings, or my fresh things, and then I layer that with my harder or woodier or dead things in a proportion of 2 to 1, 2 darks or hards to 1 green or soft. So I can make it in a pile. I could bury that all in a hole. But the reason that I go with this kind of framework is because I like to be able to turn it easily, to keep it all contained, to keep it tidy. Because Lord knows, you can tell from looking at my yard, I love tidy. But anyway, so in answer to that question, you can use anything. Can you use a trash can? You want to make sure that there's really good drainage, because if your garbage is rotting and it's wet and it sinks and it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't get absorbed into the ground or washed away or soaked up by something, it's going to really, really, really start to stink. And stinking is what we don't want in our compost bin. What I'm going to put into it in the very bottom, so that I know there's good drainage, is I've got old sticks and stuff. So I'm throwing them in the bottom. That's definitely carbon, but it will eventually break down, but mostly it will make sure that there's good drainage, and will also make sure that there's lots of air in the bottom. So then I'm going to put my I'll put a layer of leaves in there, then I'll put a layer of garbage in there, then I'll put another layer of leaves in there, then I'll water it, then I'll put more garbage in it, and then bury it with leaves, more garbage, and bury it with leaves. And that's as complicated as it gets. I have probably 20 feet between this compost bin and the nearest soil, and yet the worms will find their way across there and fill this thing up, and I will have lots of earthworms in here as well.
Sally, this is a great point to ask. Is it worth it, or does it even make sense to add in red wigglers, which we know are really great composting and garbage eating worms, into that compost bin that you have there?
Okay, there's the jury is out on that. I mean, I could put the red wigglers in there. And they don't exactly compete with the earthworms, but what they do, I like to keep them separate because they're not a native, well, none of them are native, but they're much less native to Pennsylvania, the red wigglers. So I would rather keep them as garbage worms and keep them in my worm bin than to put them onto my compost bin. I would let the earthworms do this, because the composting process with earthworms and the different maggots that get in here, I call them maggots, they're little larvae. People get freaked out when I say maggots, but the truth of the matter is that there's flies that get in here that help the breakdown process. The little roly-polies get in here, centipedes get in here. Those are not really compatible with the red wigglers, and the earthworms will eat the red wigglers. So bottom line is I like to keep them separate. The earthworms that find their way in here do a fine job without any help from the red wigglers. And this becomes a soil amendment, which means I can add this to my soil without any fear of, I could grow right in this if I had to, because it's not as concentrated, it's not as strong as what happens when I do the worm bin. So that does seem like a nice segue to talking about worm bins. Do we want to move into that, or do we have more questions about the compost bins first? What I haven't talked about is taking this compost, which is now it's wonderful and fully ready to go into the garden. How do I want to get it out into the garden? Do I want to sift the junk out of it first? I would, and the easiest way to sift it is to just put it in one of those crates, and when it dries out a little bit, shake it, so that, or I can dig through it with my fork and pull out all the plastic bags, all the forks, the coffee bottles, the different things, that the flotsam and jetsam of the kitchen that don't really belong in the garden. I found all of my serving spoons buried in my garden last week. But that's a personal embarrassment. I shouldn't even have said that. So I can take this bin of stuff that I just hauled out of here, eggshells and rubber bands and all, and I can dump this use this right as a top dress in my soil. I could use it as a mulch. I could dig it in as I'm planting new things, because I'm going to start planting new things next week. I could add a little bit of this to my window boxes. I could do that. But this is ready to go right out into the garden as soil.
So Sally, with a bin like that even though it's not airtight, the way that you're really circulating the air through it is by turning your soil, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Which is why this is an extremely passive one. This gets turned once a year. The reason it gets turned once a year is because generally we take buckets of compost with us to Mess Fest, which is a Franklin Institute's festival for kids, and we let the kids dig in it with magnifying glasses and chopsticks and play with all of the stuff that they find in it. So that is the time that it then gets cleaned out. So that's usually a springtime. There's the groundhog walked across my yard. I'm not ADD. At that time, we'll take some buckets, and then the rest of it gets dumped into the different garden beds. So I only turn this once a year, and I still get prodigious amounts of compost out of it. If I were an organized person and I were turning this, I would have no flies. I would have no smell. I would, within weeks, all of the recognizable stuff, the garbage would only be recognizable for at the very top, because the rest of it would have been turned in and already digested and turned into soil. So the energy that you put in it turns up the speed. It's like you've turned up the gas on it, and it really moves much faster if you are making sure that there's more air in it. Because what happens is this gets waterlogged because it's right under the roof line. It gets waterlogged when you get a heavy rain. So it will get anaerobic and it will smell bad. You don't want that. Unless you're willing to put up with that, you want to be turning your soil and making sure that there's lots of air in it every week.
This is also a great segue into Paula's question, which is, do you have an opinion about those compost bins that have that are rotating, the ones that you spin? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think they're lovely. I'm not going to sit down on that. I'm going to move over here. The nice thing about them, coming back around here to the table so that I can show you my worm bins. The nice thing about them is that you don't have to actually touch the soil. You just, you turn the crank. All right, now you're gonna It's not working. So you turn the crank on them, and it does the turning for you. It adds lots of air, and it keeps it from getting still, and it keeps the bugs from getting a little too settled in it. And the problem is that you need 3 of them. I mean, often people, and those things are expensive. I've seen the tri-built ones, they're fantastic, and they wear like iron, and you turn them and turn them and turn them, and the problem is you have to stop adding anything to it, or it will never get digested. You have to stop eating. It has to stop eating so that it can digest its food. So what you need is actually 3 of those. And if they cost you $200 a piece, that's $600 worth of compost to be able to, you fill one, close it up, and keep turning it. You start the second one, keep turning it, keep turning the first one. And then when this one fills up, you seal it, and you keep turning the first one and the second one. And now you're filling the third one, and you're turning it. And by the time the third one is full, the first one is totally digested, and it's ready to go for soil. So if you are not willing to go that expense, you do a pallet bin, which is just, you know, a square of pallets, and you turn with a shovel or with a pitchfork, and then you seal one. By sealing it doesn't mean making it airtight. It means making it so that everybody knows not to put anything else in it. So you stop putting stuff in it, but you keep turning it. And you turn it into the second bin. The second bin is breaking down, and then you turn it into the third bin. And by the time you're done turning it in the third bin, it's turned to soil, and you're back to the first bin again. So love those turny things, but expensive, and you need to have 3 of them. What you want is you want to make sure that there's lots of air, because anaerobic means lack of oxygen. And anaerobic, when something goes anaerobic, that means that there's no air in there, there's no oxygen in there to feed the critters. So what happens is those critters that survive without the oxygen, the anaerobic bacteria, that's the stuff that stinks. That's the stuff that makes you have the sulfur, the sulfur or the methane smell, that poop smell. So what you want to make sure is that you have the right proportion of carbons to nitrogen, of browns to greens, which is 2 to 1, browns to green, so that the greens, as they're breaking down, don't overwhelm the system and promote the growth of the anaerobic bacteria. So by turning it weekly, by making sure that it's not too wet, and making sure that there's plenty of drainage in the bottom, that's what makes it not stink. So hopefully, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that you can do. Make sure that your greens are small. So the garbage that you generate, which is your kitchen scraps or your grass clippings or your weeds or anything like that, if you can make that into the smallest pieces possible. I mean, my ideal would be to have a garbage disposal and have the garbage disposal feed right through the hole in the wall into the compost bin, so that that stuff is just microscopic, and it would break down so fast and there would be absolutely no smell, and I would have compost in a week. So if you don't have enough of your browns or you don't have enough of your greens, then you borrow from someone else, or you can harvest weeds from your backyard and put them in, as long, like I said before, as long as they don't have weed seeds. Now look at me, I'm disgusting. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this fancy dancy worm bin that I have here, which is like an apartment complex of lots and lots of layers that all fit together, and it's kind of cool. It's you can see me through it, so you know that it's screening. It's large enough, the holes are large enough that worms can get in and out of them, but it's not so large that the garbage will fall through. So this has been sitting in my basement since the flower show. I added worms to it at that point and some garbage. And here's my garbage. It hasn't all broken down. And here's my worms. You can see my worms all shimmying there. And
they look fake.
They look like gummy worms? Well, they are real. I'm not going to taste them. They are real. I have an avocado pit that's trying to grow. Somebody must have fed these since they came. So what you do, how it works is you put, you mix in the garbage, the greens and the browns in the bottom layer. Let's see. Okay. The very bottom layer is just for the liquid. And you can see it's got a tap on it. So as the garbage rots down and is eaten and produces liquid, that goes down here. And then I can tap this with, I can just tap this and drain off the fluid and add that to my watering can and water my plants with it. So what I've done is I take the bottom layer and I put my garbage in it, and you can't see it because that's life. But I put the garbage in, I put my greens and my browns, and I introduce the worms to it. And then I put this lid down on it and I roll away. All of these layers are the same, they're the screening. So I
Sally,
yeah?
Sally, when you're adding your greens and your browns, are you using the same ratio as the passive compost bin?
You know, I really don't. When I start the bin, where is it? Oh, I've lost it. It's over there. I started out, all right, I misspoke and we're going to rewind. What I do with my very first layer is I start with a lot of shredded newspaper, a lot of carbon. The worms are perfectly happy to eat nothing but carbon, but I'm tricking them into eating my garbage as well, which they're happy to do, but they really don't need it. They'd be perfectly happy if I just threw dried leaves in here and shredded newspaper and dampened it down to where to a nice, the consistency of a wrung out sponge. I don't want it to be drippy wet, but I don't want it to be too dry. They would munch away till the cows came home on just my shredded paper and my leaves. But now I'm starting to add the garbage, and that accelerates the process. So I get them settled in here with the newspaper, the wetted newspaper, and just a tiny little bit of garbage and some dried leaves. And then I put the lid on it. And once they're settled, I can start putting garbage in the next layer. So when they're done eating that's down here, I'll add garbage, and then because this is in my basement, I don't want a lot of fruit flies and stuff, so I will bury the garbage in either the dried leaves or the shredded newspaper, totally cover it so that none of the garbage is exposed to the air. Because then the fruit flies won't come in, and because they are surface dwellers, they'll come in and they'll lay eggs on the surface of the garbage, and then the worms will go deep. But as long as it's covered, I don't get the fruit fly situation. So I put the next layer on, and I put some garbage in there covered with my carbon. And then when the worms are done with this, they say, moving on up. So they'll go up through the holes to get to the fresh garbage. And most of them will move up into the next layer. And then as that starts to get filled up and digested, I will put another layer on and do the same thing again. Garbage buried by dry leaves or shredded newspaper. And by the time they've moved up to the third floor, mostly the stuff down here, it has no more food for them to eat, so they've left. They've moved out, moved up, moved up. So I can take this bottom layer, put that, dump that in the into the garbage. I would sort out the worms first, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And just keep going. And I've done this. I mean, I have enough. You can buy up to 7 layers, but I've never needed more than this. And then the bottom one becomes my source of compost. And then the next one, once this is emptied, then it becomes the top layer. So I just keep taking the bottom one and putting it on top. So questions on that so far, because I'm going to talk about how you get the worms separated from the compost. And then I want to talk about the cheap version that doesn't cost $117.
I think we're good to keep rolling.
Okay, we're good to keep rolling. Okay, I went to the box store and I bought these very, very exclusive, expensive bins with lids. One of them, I drilled holes in the bottom, and you can't see them, they're small, but you can see there's a big hole here because I want this to drain. So I've got 2 bins, and I stuck something in the bottom of this. I just found this random thing. Otherwise, I could put flower pots in there because I would like this, which has no drainage holes, to catch any of the goop that comes out of this one. So I'm setting this, as you can see, it doesn't fit all the way down in. It sits up on top of that, whatever it is that I stuck in there, flower pot. And then I will prepare this. I'm not doing this in layers. I'm just using this one bin forever and forever. So this is the one that I would put the, I have shredded newspaper here somewhere. I know I do. I'll put the shredded newspaper in the bottom, but in its stead, I will use, for now, but you'll pretend. I would prefer to use the newspaper because I'm starting out clean, but instead I'm using dried leaves. So I'm going to put the dry leaves in the bottom, and I'm going to fill it up about 1/3 of the way with either dried leaves or shredded newspaper. And I'm going to dampen it because I want to make sure that everything is, like I said before, about as wet as a wrung out sponge. I don't want water sitting in the bottom because the worms don't like to sit in water. So I've got, I've done that, and then I throw a little sand in there because they're like chickens. They like grit in their crops. They don't really have crops. They're just like one long digestive tube, but sand in there helps to keep the food moving in their systems. So I've put my carbon in there. I wetted it down. I'm going to add my worms. Now, where do we get our worms? Both Cassidy and I love Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. Uncle Jim doesn't give us a kickback, but Uncle Jim always has a good sale going. And I always buy a lot more than I need because then I share with my friends. Because generally it costs as much to get 5 pounds as it does to get 2 pounds. So Uncle Jim's Worm Farm is where I go. Also at Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, you can get a lot of like lesson plans and information if you want to be doing this with kids. They sell books as well. So it's, like I said, very complicated. You put carbon in, you keep it damp, you add the worms, and then slowly over time, once your worms get settled, which takes a couple days, because they just came in the mail, they freak out, they try to escape. I put them in here. I put them in the bottom of the shower, and I turn all the lights on. They hate light. And they stay in there because they don't want to come out in the light. And gradually they get acclimated to it. It takes a couple days. And then I start to add garbage. I add small amounts of garbage, and I totally cover it with dry leaves or shredded newspaper. Constantly, it's the same process. Sometimes I will put all the garbage on this side, because my bin of garbage is about, it's about half a gallon size. It's a potato salad from the deli container. And I put that much garbage in here on this side and I bury it. Then the next time I empty the garbage, I put it on the other side and I bury it. And what you'll see is the worms will go right to it, and the worms will reproduce, and there's lots more worms. And eventually, by the time, if I keep doing that, I don't let it get too wet. I make sure that it's never sitting in its own juice, it's never stewing in its own juices. I always add enough carbon to soak up the wetness. And if it starts to get too wet, because when garbage breaks down, it's wet. I peel the corner back and stick a roll of paper towels down there, and it wicks all of the moisture up, and then the worms eat the paper towels, and they're very happy. You can use the cheap ones. You don't have to get it inexpensive. But it does do the trick, and you can walk away from these for months, and they will just gradually eat everything, and then they stop reproducing. So they can go, you could probably walk away from this for 6 months and still have living worms in it, and then you re-energize it and they start to reproduce again. How do you get the worms out when you want to start using the worm compost, and what would you use worm compost for? And why is it different than regular compost? Well, regular compost, like I said, is, as it breaks down, it's still much larger pieces than worm compost. Worm compost is very, very fine and very, very strong. So you would use worm compost as almost like a fertilizer. You could take the juice out of the bottom of this or out of that bottom tray, and pour a cup of it into a gallon of water, and then water your plants with that. And that not only puts the nutrients into the soil, but it also puts all those micro critters that the worms, and now I have bugs flying around my head because I'm just so composty energized. Where are my, this is worm compost that I took out of my big bin. It's still got recognizable pieces in it. Here's a ear of corn that they didn't eat. The fun part is they never do eat the ear, but they like the inside. And generally you open it up and worms fall out of it. So there are still recognizable pieces in it. But what happens is I dumped this out. It has worms and compost in it. And I put this out in the sun. They hate the sun. They hate the heat. They hate the fresh air. And so what they do is they go deep. So what I do is I peel off the compost, which is now the worms have gotten out of, and they've gone deep. So you can see they're all down in the middle because they've tried to get to the coolest, deepest, away from the light spot. So I'll just, over the course of the afternoon of them sitting in the sun, I'll just keep peeling the edges away and the surface away, exposing the worms, and they'll say, ah, and they go deeper. And eventually I've got this gnarly mass of worms all the way down at the bottom, and that's what I'll take and dump into my newly renovated bin. Then I take this stuff, this is not broken down enough. This has still got, the problem was that I used just oak leaves, and oak leaves are very, very, very fibrous. They take a really long time, much longer to break down than do maple leaves. So they're still recognizable. You can see that that's a red oak. You can still see the shape of the leaves. So I learned my lesson on that, and I will not use oak leaves, just oak leaves. I'll use a mix. Okay, how do you decide? Easily is how much time do you want to put into it? So how active are you going to make it? If it's going to be totally passive and you've got a big yard and it's in the end of the yard, then perfect for you. If you're in a hurry to get compost and you want to make sure that there is no recognizable garbage, so you're in a community garden, then you want a bigger one, but you want to be constantly turning it, so it becomes one of the chores of the garden. If you're in an apartment, worm bin is a good idea. Doesn't have to be fancy. Could be the common, the regular tote. And people talk about having under the sink. I guess that the only one that I would consider putting under the sink is the one that the fermentation one. You can't see this, but behind here, the birds know that the worms are here, and there's catbirds lined up waiting because I had this sitting over there and they were recreationally digging in it.
I guess that's one way to separate your worms, is to let the
one way
catbird
to
just
separate
eat
the
them.
worms is to feed it to all of the birds.
Sacrifice your worms.
Yeah. They must have, they're usually fruit eaters, but they must have babies because they're going for the protein now.
So Patty is asking about the pallet bin. Are you stacking the pallets on top of each other or using it to build the sides of the bin? How deep should the compost be?
Okay, let me see. Do I have a pallet standing here? No. La, la, la. This is so much fun.
I've seen it where people that are using pallets, they set them up vertically so that they create 3 separate sections for composting, but essentially it's a compost pile that's being separated by the pallet bins.
Okay, I'm going to use some pieces of paper to pretend that those are pallets. If you know what a pallet is, then you'll understand this. If you have no idea what a pallet is, then do a web search for images and you'll see exactly what they are. But what the important part is that pallets come in many, each one is unique, and what you want to make sure is that on the profile of the pallet, so this is, you know, it's got a front, it's got some boards across it this way and some boards this way, and then on the back it's got boards that go the other way, but on the side you can see that there's a fatness, and the fatness is a thicker like a 4x4 or 2x4. Stamped into the side of it will say HT. HT means heat treated. Very, very important, because these things are coming from other countries. They could be carrying diseases or insects or stuff like that. So they spray them with pesticides, or they paint them with god-awful stuff, or they heat treat them in a kiln. And you want the ones that haven't been sprayed and haven't been painted. You want the ones that just are heat treated, and they will say HT, like a brand burned into the side of it. So I've got a pallet, and I've got a pallet, and I've got a pallet, and pretty much those 3 pallets, which I love my little pieces of paper. I could not live without these pieces of paper. So I'm taking 2 pallets and I'm putting them together end to end like this. And since they're pretty open architecture, I can take zip ties or cut a wire coat hanger or use wire, and I can just wire them together so that they become to be a corner. So then I've got 3 pieces, and they're kind of like this. Now I can take another 2 pallets and put them like this. Now you're gonna have to pretend. And like this, and I can keep doing this until I've got a whole set of 3 of them. And that's just a nice place. Now this is this way, it's this way. And then I just put all my compost in there. And then when I have it filled up, I close it with another one, or close it with another one, so that people know not to put anything more in it. If it's in a group home, or if it's in just my yard, I know not to put anything in it. And then I can take stuff out of this bin, and with a fork I can put it in, transfer into the next bin. Is that does that make sense?
That makes sense. It's essentially just a 3-bin composting system,
it's a
but it's
3-bin
made out of
composting
pallets.
system, but it's made out of pallets. So what did it cost you? Whatever you had to do to get them home. Pallets come in all sizes, so do your best. They don't always perfectly match.
The other piece too is that there isn't any exact measurement from the compost gods that are going to be like, you have to have your compost
police
bin.
are going to come. Compost police are going to come, And
there's no pressure to do
yeah,
that.
no, there's not. I mean, it's your aesthetic. I mean, that's why I managed to get my whole household to accept this, because it's not an ugly thing that looks like, you know, it's like a thing full of garbage next to the house, which it really is. It's a thing full of garbage next to the house, but it's nice and tidy. The ones from the city looked like Darth Vader helmets. And I mean, they were round, and you just kept putting, mine
I know
happened to
exactly
be,
what you're talking
yeah,
about.
they do. They look like Darth Vader, and they're black, so that's even better. So they really do look like helmets. So it doesn't really matter what you make them out of. You can use chicken wire, you can use nothing. It's just that nothing, as it settles, just keeps getting wider. If you've only got this much space, then you have to put walls on it to keep it in that much space. If you don't care and you're just throwing stuff in a pile in the corner of the yard, then who cares what it looks like? Eventually, when you go to use it, you're going to take the unfinished stuff off the top, you're going to dig the good stuff out of the bottom, and then you're going to put the unfinished stuff on the bottom and keep adding new stuff. So it's going to break down, because that's nature's process. But the things that you do, hurry it along or keep it more tidy or make sure that it doesn't smell, those are all just aesthetic considerations, because it's gonna rot. That's what the world does. It just, you know, big pieces turn into little pieces, things rot. So
Okay, Sally, what about temperature? So I know for the worms, you don't want the worms to be too cold to the point that they're going to freeze and die on you, but you don't want your worms to be too hot either.
the worms, I mean, it's going to be 100 degrees this week. It's already, what is it, 96 now? Actually, it's nice and shady here, so it's probably only 94 here. It's hot, and what they do is they will go deep. You don't want to put your compost bin in full sun all day. Well, actually you could, but if you're using worms you don't want to put your worm bin where it's going to be hot. You want to put that where it's always shady. So mine lives up against the house.
What about for your compost? Not the worm bin, but the compost.
Your compost doesn't care. The thing is
the heat would probably just help it break down faster,
yes,
right?
but it will dry it out faster. So you need to make sure, which is why a covered compost bin that you can regulate the amount of water that's in it is ultimately a better deal, because every time it dries out, progress ceases. So until the next time it rains, and so you just keep. So heat, worms, it's bad. Heat is bad for worms, but it's not bad for your compost otherwise. So, but watch the moisture level.
Okay, and let's talk about manure. When do you put manure in the compost? Is that something that you even do?
Manure is considered a green. Even though it's brown, it's considered a green because it's very high in nitrogen. The term greens and browns doesn't necessarily, it's a category rather than a specific color, because your greens can be potatoes, they can be carrots, they don't have to be, but that just means they're high in nitrogen. So it's like carbs and sugars. They're not all carbs, they're not all sugars. Greens and browns. Manure is a green. So cow manure is good because it's not as high in nitrogen, so it won't burn things so fast. Horse manure is very hot, so that's very high in nitrogen. So you don't want to use a lot of horse manure, or if you don't want to put it in your garden fresh, you really want to mellow it out in a compost bin. So adding that, you would be just like you're adding garbage. You want to make sure that you add that, and you want to make sure that you add browns to balance it.
Do you have a ratio of like 7-3 or like 1-3?
Easiest if you just say 2-1, but it really is 7-3. But who's going to count? You know, it's easier to do 2 of
and
these.
It's 2-1 what? It's like two greens?
2 browns to 1 green, or 70 browns to 30 greens. That the idea that greens are alive and browns are dead is a pretty good way to look at it. So, you know, you've got vegetables, they're pretty much recently been alive, whereas the dried leaves are less recently alive. Manure just came out of a live cow, so it's pretty living. So that's also, thank you for that, Leslie, that analogy. That
I was gonna be kind of a smart blank and say, Sally, blink twice if you're reading the chat, so we would know if Leslie was the one that gave you that answer.
Leslie was the one that gave me that answer, so thank you, Leslie. And we're going to check in with you later to see how your watermelons are doing.
All right, Sally, do you have a brand of organic fertilizer that you recommend that's commercially available? I know the one that we've talked about a few times now is the kelp.
That's a brand versus kind. Kelp is good, but kelp is highly processed. So I only use added fertilizer when things start to look peaked. Like when my tomatoes are starting to wear out because they pumped out a lot of tomatoes and you're starting to see that the leaves are going yellow, I might give them a shot of something other than my standard go-to, which is worm compost or regular compost. So I have espoma here, which is supposed to be organic, and I have a lot of that because they've been our sponsor at the flower show. So not necessarily better, but hey, support our sponsors. Espoma. I don't know if you can still get this stuff. Terrace, I don't know if that's still on the market. This has been sitting on my shelf for a couple of years, but they're a really fantastic group of people because they not only recycle garbage to make worm compost, which they then sell as a worm tea, but they recycle water bottles, and they were collecting them from schools. Schools were collecting them and they were buying them from the schools. So they were supporting the schools, recycling the bottles, recycling the garbage, and giving us a good product. So I kind of like them. So see if Terrace is still out there. Miracle Grow is a good emergency. If you're going to have judges coming to see your garden in 2 weeks, I give everything a quick shot of Miracle Grow. Not a lot, dilute, and it'll green things. Spray it like all over the plants because the plants will immediately respond by going green. It's a flash in the pan, so you got to time it right, because as soon as the judges are gone, the next time it rains, it's gone out of the soil. So
also, Sally, do you have somewhere where you get manure from for your garden?
Well, there are certain kind of manures that you like and some that you don't like. I go up to Saul High School and get cow manure and horse manure. I'm not sure, I have to think about it, which one it is that they put out that you can get right off the, right next to the cow barn. So I'm assuming it's cow manure because I don't think they go up and out and scoop the horse poop out of the fields. So it's cow manure. I used to have guinea pigs and I used to have bunnies, and that stuff is fantastic. I use that a lot in my garden over time. Do not use dog and cat poop. Not good. Not good, because there are diseases that people share with dogs and cats and some parasites. So you don't want that kind of, you don't want that in your, but the natural resource that I've got much more than manure is my household garbage. So I tend to rely on that really heavily. I'm going to blink 3 times to say yes. The chats that are coming by right now are asking a lot about eggshells. So let's talk about eggshells for a second. Eggshells take...
Well, Sally, we're talking about blossom end rot, which eggshells do take a long time. And I did say earlier, the real trick to solving blossom end rot is just watering and making sure that you're on a good watering schedule with your tomatoes. And I'll let you jump in with like the science.
I support you on that. Eggshells are a source of calcium, but they take freaking forever to break down, as is evidenced by my my compost has been there a year and it's still got recognizable eggshells in it. So the problem is not that there is no soil calcium in the soil, because Philadelphia, Pennsylvania soils are not low in calcium. The problem is that the calcium molecule is large and it takes actively moving water up from the roots into the plants to carry the calcium up. And the furthest that it has to go is the very bottom of your tomato, the fruit. So if there's not a balanced, consistent flow of water, like things take a break and the calcium is heavy, and it either sticks or goes back down because it's a heavier molecule. You got to have consistent watering so that the water can move the calcium all the way up the plant, out and into the bottom of the fruit, because calcium is what holds the cells together. And if there's not enough calcium, the cells in the end of the fruit break down, and that's what gives you that ugly black rot on the bottom of your tomatoes. So
2 questions, Sally.
Good watering and then mulching.
1, can you use Epsom salts to fix it? Would that be faster? And 2
is not calcium.
Okay,
Epsom salt is
2,
magnesium.
what's a good watering schedule for tomatoes?
If it doesn't rain, an inch of rain a week is what we want on our plants. If it hasn't rained in 3 or 4 days, it's time to water again. So you want to water the roots of the plants, not necessarily the plants. You want to water the roots because that's less wasteful, and it also doesn't set up a high moisture level on the leaves that causes mold to grow. And then make sure that you mulch, because it's the problem of the high moisture, then low moisture, then high moisture, then low moisture. If you put an insulating blanket of mulch on your soil, then you don't have the highs and lows. And so your plants it's much easier for them to consistently draw calcium up out of the soil.
Sally, do you suggest like crushing your eggshells? I put mine in like a mortar and pestle until it gets really fine. Do you think that makes a difference?
I mean, that would certainly help. I mean, in an ideal world, what I would have is a blender that's specifically for my garbage. Like I said, for my garbage disposal to go right out through the wall into the compost bin would be my dream house. So the smaller the particles, yes, the easier it is for it to break down.
Yeah. And would you say that, like, rather than like living and dying by this 1 inch a week rule, would you say that like just watching your tomato plant and making sure that like you're not seeing signs of stress is a good way to figure out the watering? Like I know leaf curling is one way to really figure out your tomato schedule. All right, Sally. We're getting a lot of questions about mildew on plants and how to get rid of them.
Mildew on plants is not get ridable. What you try to do is to prevent it from happening. It's not going to kill your plants mostly. All right, we're good. We are now on charged up. Am I here? Did I lose you?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Okay, here I am. There we are. Okay. Mildew. Mildew is an issue that's caused by too much moisture on leaves and warm night temperatures. So the mold likes to happen when those conditions are set up. Now you get to see the other side of my yard. And that brief appearance from Stanley. Stanley's the wonderful man who ran us an Ethernet cable, physically ran us a cable so that we could broadcast from outside without losing the internet. So thank you for Stanley. All right, so now you get to see my Japanese maple trees. So back to this mildew. You can spray fungicides on your plants, but generally the plants that get mildew, specifically, zinnias get it really bad and zucchinis get it really bad. So what you more set yourself up for is the different blights with tomatoes when the leaves are too moist. On the other hand, if the leaves get too dry and you're not adding moisture to the system in the air, you get spider mites. So, you know, it's like finding balance, grasshopper. But generally, watering in the morning, except for these horrible hot days, I will probably water this evening and let them have the evening to recover. But we talked before in previous sessions about planting indicator plants. And in my vegetable garden, basil is my indicator plant because it wilts at the drop of a hat. If it is too dry, your basil will tell you, and you'll be able to see it from a distance because it will really flag. And you water it and it recovers happily. So, and it doesn't kill the plant. So not a problem. So using basil or coleus in my more ornamental stuff, I use that as my indicator.
I do want to check in with everyone that's participating today and see if there are any other questions specifically about compost or worm bins that we can answer before we move on to other questions about general gardening. We have about 20 minutes left of the workshop, so I just want to make sure that we're staying on topic as long as we need to. So Linda is asking about slugs and ants in a compost bin on an apartment terrace.
In a compost bin or on a, okay. Slugs, I knock on wood. There's wood here somewhere. Slugs has not been an issue. Snails, my son gets snails in his because his is outside and wide open. Ants, if you're turning your compost, your ants hate that. So ants has not been an issue in a wet compost bin. They would much prefer, if I let it sit there and do nothing and it dries out, then I'm going to get ants. Now I do get ants in my bags of dry leaves, which I remember I said I collected them off the street in the fall. And I brought them home and I put them up against my fig tree as insulation for the winter. And the ants so totally loved those. So I have to constantly move them because as soon as I move them, it alarms the ants so much that they move out. Now they might move back in tomorrow, but as long as I keep things moving. So keep your compost turning if you're worried about ants. In your compost. If you're just worried about ants on your deck, I don't know what to do. I have never seen a year like this for ants in my life.
All right, Sally. Mimi's asking, what are the best green items to put in compost and what are the best brown items, would you say?
It depends on whether I'm talking about worm compost or just my regular compost bin. My regular compost bin, my staple is the dried leaves that I collected in the fall. I use them. I also, because leaves fall everywhere, I'll periodically sweep up my patio and just take that stuff, the frass it's called, I don't know, all of that loose stuff that collects from the wind blowing it in, that's not trash. I use that as a brown. But consistently, the best thing that I use is the brown, the dried leaves, because they were free and I got lots of them in the fall. And I stacked them up, and they're happy to give back to me. Now, some of them, when I raked up my own leaves off the lawn, off the not lawn in the fall, I ran them over a couple times with the lawnmower. Because remember I showed you the leaves are not breaking down in my worm compost because it's oak leaves and they're still whole oak leaves. If I had run them over with the lawnmower, again, making the particles smaller, they would have broken down much faster.
Okay, Sally, how soon would you say you can expect to get compost if you turn it, but it's not big enough to get hot in the middle?
Oh, hot in the middle, it's still going to break down. It's just hot in the middle is what breaks it down much faster. And it also breaks it down so that it kills the weed seeds and most diseases. My dad was a fanatic about his compost bin, and he would turn it every couple of days, and he would go around and he would collect stuff from everybody else. And we roasted corn in his compost bin one year. I mean, we just tunneled in and stuck ears of corn in there and roasted them because it got
that sounds like a fable.
It does, doesn't it? But I have seen when I saw a couple questions go by. Excuse me, I'm gonna I just lost it. Oh, the heat. I saw mushroom soil questions go by. So I want to talk about mushroom compost because that is horse manure and hay, and it's mixed together, and as it rots, the mushrooms grow in it. It's fantastic stuff. We were able, for the community gardens, we got some from Laurel Valley, which is my favorite. They're also a sponsor, but they are totally organic. They're one of the few totally organic mushroom growers, and we buy their compost, and we would get it in 18 wheelers would come in and dump it in the really big gardens, and it would sit there and it would steam and it would steam and it would steam for weeks because the density, it reached critical mass because it was huge piles, and in the winter it was still steaming, and the neighborhood cats would burrow in and sleep in it because it was so warm. In the old days, you would put in a cold frame, you would make it a hotbed. You would call it a hotbed, and that's what hotbeds are. You would put manure in the bottom of it, cover it with soil, and as the manure rotted down, it would generate heat, and that's what would keep your little mini greenhouse warm over the winter. You would just keep mounding manure into it and generating heat to keep your plants from freezing. So mushroom compost, good. Heat, good. Heat, not necessary, but heat, good.
Are you waiting for me to ask another question?
I'm waiting for you to ask the next question.
I got distracted. I was petting Millie.
Hey, Millie.
Okay, so it's funny. There's another Sally with us today.
I know.
So Sally,
I didn't say that.
Sally in the chat is asking, I fertilized for the first time this year in my raised bed, other than composting castings, Espoma, all-purpose plant food 533. My pineapple tomato isn't flowering yet. Opinion on whether 533 was a mistake.
533 is higher nitrogen than it is anything else. And so what you're going to get if you use a lot of it is you're going to get, because nitrogen is for leaf growth, you're going to get a lot of vegetative growth. So you would want to use a higher first number in your you would at this time of year side dress, unless you were using water soluble and pouring it on. So you might have promoted, you're going to get a flush of green growth, but give it time. Because nitrogen, I'm being mosquitoed now. Nitrogen is fast moving and leaves fast. So that's why you got to keep adding more compost to keep the nitrogen levels up.
Okay, and then Sandra, Oh, sorry, I was going to jump to the next thing.
If you are using more of a higher middle numbers, then if you're going to be using anything, use higher middle number for a vegetable, for fruiting vegetables, not for leafy vegetables. Leafy vegetables, high first number, because you want that leafy growth, like lettuce and spinach and stuff like that. You're fine with that. A quick little side note on the numbers in fertilizer. I don't usually talk about lawns because I don't believe in lawns, but a lot of the big name fertilizers have taken the middle number out of their fertilizer for lawns, because lawns are about as absorbent of rainfall as concrete. So what happens when you heavily fertilize your lawn, which is what you need to do to keep it green so that you can keep cutting, so that you can use more petrochemical fuels to mow it down, so that you can have very expensive green to put into your compost bin. Because it washes down into the sewers, and then it washes down the storm sewers, and so especially the phosphorus, goes straight to the river, and that's what causes algae blooms. So know your numbers, and do your homework and know what it is you're supposed to be using on what crop.
All right. So Sandra was
Thanks,
asking
Sally.
about.
Hallelujah. Thank you.
Sandra was asking about manure and herbicides. If it's true that using them on grass that the cows eat, that the manure can kill the plants. Is it true about manure and herbicides on the grass? That
they don't use herbicides in use of herbicides in fields that cows are going to be grazing isn't a common thing. I mean, you might here and there use, the problem is that they use a lot of Roundup on the grains, because that's what guarantees that you're going to get a dried out grain. And then feeding those same grains to cows puts a lot of that into their systems. It's not, by the time it gets through the cow and gets into your compost bin and gets through the composting process, there's not much bad stuff left, because the breakdown process really does break down the larger molecules. By shortening that process and using weed killer on your lawns, and then cutting the grass and putting that into your compost, if you use the compost too soon, you could kill your vegetables, or at least stunt their growth, because it hasn't had enough time and digestion to break it down. So note to self, don't use weed killer on the lawn and then cut the lawn and put it in your compost. I'm not really crazy. There really are mosquitoes buzzing around my head. I can always tell when an hour and 45 minutes has gone by, because suddenly the bug spray has worn off.
Okay, so I think we've gotten through the majority of, I think we've gotten through all of the questions, unless someone has a lingering question. And we probably have time for 2 more. We have 10 minutes left of our session today.
All right.
Do you want to field this question about the tree in South Philly, Sally? How you would recommend fertilizing it?
Trees don't need much fertilizer. We used to been planting trees now for over 50 years, and we go through different stages where we recommend this, and then we decide, no, that's not such a great idea. This is important. Generally, you don't want to fertilize your tree. What you want to do is you want to put a nice layer of compost over its roots. But the compost rule, mulch, compost as a mulch or some kind of mulch that that breaks down and eventually feeds the roots. Organic matter is what you need. Do you need to fertilize a tree, especially a street tree? No. Because street trees are so subject to stress, moisture stress, and road salt and sidewalk salt and dog pee and all of those things. What you need to add instead, I mean, do not add a fertilizer because that's just one more salt in the mix. What you do want to do is add compost, because compost as a carbon, you know, breaks down into the different components, but the largest one is carbon, and that's the great buffer. I mean, carbon, charcoal, carbon filters what they put on cigarettes to keep the crap out of your lungs. All of that, charcoal filters in fish tanks, all of that, it's all carbon. So keep adding compost to your trees, not fertilizer. Again, way more words than is needed. Okay.
Sally, would you suggest watering the trees because it's so hot?
Watering the trees is so important, especially on hot days. So 5 gallons a week. The easiest way to know that it got 5 gallons a week, if it didn't rain, is to have a bucket with holes drilled in it, small holes, like 1/4-inch holes, 1/8-inch holes. Fill the bucket and let it trickle down. And you'll know that you've gotten, that it went slowly and that it didn't wash away and that it soaked down. So unless you got, even heavy rains, the problem is we've got them on the sidewalk and maybe the sidewalk is sloped away from the tree. So did the water actually get into the roots of the tree? No guarantees. So especially young trees, you really 5 gallons every 3 days for newly planted trees in the summer, and once a week for larger trees. If the tree looks like it's got no stress, then I wouldn't worry so much about it, except if you see the leaves wilting, get out there and water it.
I think that might be the last question.
Something about chewing things on the pepper plants. I don't know what's chewing on the pepper plants. Keep looking for worms of some sort or another and squish them. If you've got 500 pepper plants and you're going with organic, sucking insects, get insecticidal soap. Chewing insects, get neem, but don't use neem if you are worried about bees coming and pollinating your stuff. Peppers are self-pollinated, tomatoes are self-pollinated. You don't have to worry about spraying neem on them because the bees don't come to them. But the bees do come to squashes and cucumbers and pumpkins, so you want to make sure that you're not using neem on them. Watering at the drip line, it's hard to water at the drip line. Does anybody know what a drip line is? I know this is a beginner gardener class. A drip line is if you see a tree and it's the shape of the tree, if water comes down over the ends of the trees and if the tree is an umbrella and the water comes off the end and comes down and makes a circle around the tree, that's the drip line. Watering at the drip line, more important to water near the base, but water, if you've got a lawn and you can water up to the drip line, that's fine. Very difficult to do that when you've got a tree in a sidewalk. The drip line is going to be in the street, so it's not going to help anybody. Flea beetles on eggplants and tomato leaves. Marianne, you know the answer to that. The old people, I mean, when I was a young gardener, the old people would put either lime or talcum powder or self-rising flour. They would sprinkle that on their eggplants and tomatoes because it irritates the heck out of the flea beetles. And I still hold to that. All of those things will irritate the heck out of the flea beetles. More now people use diatomaceous earth, which is ground up tiny little seashells, because again, like talcum powder, it irritates the heck out of the flea beetles. Not so much lime. I don't recommend, unless you know that your soil is acid, which most soil here in Philadelphia is not. Most soil here leans more toward alkaline. Don't be using lime on anything for any reason. Next week, we're going to talk about soil tests. So we'll talk more about acid and alkaline and all of those things next week.
Can you use the diatomaceous earth on the leaves?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Just know you're going to have to redo it after it rains, because especially now with the rains being so heavy, they wash it all off.
Okay.
So you got to use it again. And a lot of people use that as a deterrent to slugs and snails, because again, it's sharp edges. It's like ground glass. It's sharp edges, and nobody wants to crawl their belly over that. Using a lot of diatomaceous earth, don't use it when the wind is blowing, because you don't want to inhale it, because again, it's ground silica. It might as well be ground glass. Flea beetles, compost on the tree, excellent. You're welcome for hanging there in 95 degrees. I mean, yeah, it's like it wore my battery out fast. I was surprised at that. Phrase leaf compost, I don't know that. Using that on your tree, any kind of leaf compost is a good idea on the tree. And then cayenne pepper, that was an answer to something, but I don't know what it was, what the question was. Pastor Tom Daniel says cayenne pepper. I'm guessing that you're using that as a pest deterrent on your plants. Bugs don't have a sense of taste, so using hot pepper on anything isn't going to affect insects, but it will affect squirrels and groundhogs. I can't believe that in the middle of this class, groundhog walked right across the path in front of us. So they're getting bold. Be brave out there. Oh, cayenne pepper for beetles. Haven't ever found that to work, but if it works for you, even if it just works because it's a placebo, use it if it works for you. I think we've used up the questions, and we have 2 minutes to spare. So if anybody wants to yell out a question or cheer or share anything in the last 2 minutes, is everybody self-muted?
I would like to say something.
Yeah.
So my watermelon.
Oh, and this is Leslie. Okay.
So I still have the one watermelon. It doesn't seem to be getting any bigger, but it's getting heavy.
Ooh, especially after all that rain.
Yeah. So should I be fertilized? Like, should I be putting a compost?
Is it dark green, or what color is it?
It's a dark green, yes.
Okay. Can you very carefully roll it over and look at the belly of it?
Yes,
if it's got a yellow spot on it?
It does not.
It does not. It's still green all around.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, you still have just the one?
Just the one.
That's because it's like it's the only child, and the plant is putting everything into your only child there.
Yeah, so will another one grow? Maybe.
Probably not until that one's done, because you've shamed it. You spent so much time paying attention to this one little baby that it's like doing its best to make the world, to keep us all happy.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, do you know about thunking watermelons?
No.
You know, where you thunk on them and see if it goes gunk, 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 or
okay.
If it starts to get a thunk, thunk rather than a crack, crack,
right.
Then the more thunking it is, the more soft the inside is.
Okay.
So I'm not, it's such a gamble with watermelons until you really get to know your plants, and you have, you have a bunch of them, and you say, oh, well, I opened this one and it was still white on the inside. It was way too early. I'll know next time. So I'm not going to tell you when to open it. You just, it's like we should start a lotto or something. All right. It's 6 o'clock, kids. It's past Cassidy's bedtime. And it's still 94 out here, and I'm going to go in the house.
Yes.
And have some Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Cassidy.
So you guys are awesome.
Thank you, Sally.
So are you and Cassidy.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We do
Cassidy.
try.
Thank you, Sally.
So we'll see y'all next week. What are we talking about next week? Soil.
Soil.
Soils.
Yay!
Okay. Alrighty. And then,
I heard a yay from the audience. I guess it'll be a good webinar.
Now. Okay.
That's me. That's Leah.
All right, Leah. So we'll see you next week when we talk
You're
about
setting the
soils.
expectations high.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I got to figure out how many different positions for my poor little baby camera needs to go into before we before we learn everything about soil. Oh my goodness.
Bless you, Sally. Thank you.
Okay, take care, everybody. See
Bye,
you
everybody.
Bye-bye.